Our last discussant, our last panelist, is Carla Freccero. She's chair of History of Consciousness and, are you chairing somewhere else too?
Literature.
Literature, yeah. A lot of free time, Carla. And she's a professor of literature and history of consciousness and feminist studies at UC Santa Cruz. She's the author of numerous works, including Queer Early Modern. She's a stunning writer, as I think everyone here is. And she's presently working on a book about in/a/human figures of being. I also want to note that Carla is one of the best readers you'll ever meet, but she doesn't have a lot of time, so don't trouble her. But she really is just a stunning, gifted interlocutor. So.
Thanks, Harlan, and thanks everyone for these amazing papers in these 2 days. It's been amazing for me, and I'm such a learner in the area of human and non-human beings. This should be retitled something like Scattered Thoughts, emphasis on the scattered, on human implications in the ethics of mortality, okay? And I'm going to talk about a dispossessed animal at the end of this. It's in several parts, and please understand this contribution as incredibly modest. It's also about ethical struggle, and I haven't read this out loud, and I might not make it. I just want to let you know. And I was going to talk, but I'm glad I didn't, about companion animals and human and animal dying. I'm glad I didn't, because I thought Caroline's talk on euthanasia and veterinary clinics was really wonderful, and I really wouldn't have anything to add to that. Okay, 1, theory. In The Animal That Therefore I Am, the collected papers on the subject of the, and he problematizes this, the animal, published posthumously, Jacques Derrida articulates a principle of shared suffering between humans and the non-human living in a way that extends such suffering beyond the terms set forth by Jeremy Bentham. Bentham, it'll be remembered, was talking back to Descartes, rejecting the Cartesian criterion of thought for the taxonomizing and hierarchizing of value, ethical and moral above all, when it came to life. For Bentham, it was not reason, language, or thought, but rather shared suffering that should count in assessing ethical responsibility toward the other. It seemed that he meant by suffer to feel pain, to suffer in the sense of, and I'm quoting him, being abandoned without redress to the caprice of a tormentor. For Derrida, the change that Bentham inaugurates with this plea is to turn the focus away from capacity, pouvoir in French, the same word as the word for power, or ability, a being able defined in positive terms. Man, it is said, can reason, speak, etc., and toward a certain passivity, not exactly an incapacity, but a not being able. The Latin word for suffering, patior, captures this multivalence beautifully, for patior is suffering, endurance, patience, and passivity all in one, and the verb itself is in the passive voice. What is the non-power at the heart of power, asks Derrida, and he answers that it is mortality, what he calls the most radical means of thinking the finitude that we share with animals, the mortality that belongs to the very finitude of life. When I think about this condition that I share with all the living, I know what Derrida means when he calls it the possibility of this impossibility. Because how does a human adjust herself to such a condition, to being unto death? Just months before he died, Derrida reflected on this problem, and I'm quoting him now. No, I never learned to live. In fact, not at all. Learning to live should mean learning to die, learning to take into account so as to accept absolute mortality, that is, without salvation, resurrection, or redemption, neither for oneself nor for the other. I believe in this truth without being able to resign myself to it, and less so. I have never learned to accept it, to accept death, that is. We are all survivors who have been granted a temporary reprieve. In sacrificial cultures, especially those that produce warfare and capital punishment as their most spectacular sacrifice machines, those of us given the choice of accepting death or not have been granted a temporary and only temporary reprieve. 2, companion animals. When I read about mortality and about death and non-human animals on the internet, what I find are numerous entries responding to the query, do animals understand death? And although I very much appreciate the work that's done to show humans that non-humans have their mourning and grieving rituals, because that work teaches us something about our comme vivant, not a word, but it should be, Tamsin Osborne put it best when he said, apropos of Ghana, the gorilla in the Munster Zoo, who kept her dead baby with her and would not let go, and now I'm quoting him, the first thing that jumped into my head when I saw the picture of Ghana with her dead infant was that she looked thoroughly flummoxed. For him, the question is not, do animals understand death, but rather, do any of us, whether human or not? After a brief survey of the practices of recalling, reburying, revivifying, and speaking with the dead among various human cultures, he concludes, most people know that their dead relatives are not going to come back to life. But whether this understanding is innate or whether we're taught to believe this, I'm not sure. I had wanted to write here about the many ways companion animals teach their inexperienced humans, those who are in fact inexperienced in the ways of mortality, how to live with dying and how to prepare. I was recently moved by a colleague's story of the cat who died in his bed, where he had invited her so that in her very old age she could have the comfort of the warm-blooded creature with whom she had shared her life. Later, when one of his in-laws died, he found that his cat had helped him understand how to be near his father-in-law for the 48 hours before. His cat died at home. This had given him the courage to assist his in-law in doing the same. I remember how each of my cats' deaths filled me with a strange kind of envy, because they were put to death so peacefully and well and legally. I will have to start planning mine now, and probably clandestinely, if I want to go out that way. I have also, however, learned a lot about the biomedicalization of death through my cats. What the veterinarian used to call dying, she now calls kidney disease. Kidney disease. This is what happened with my last cat, Lenin. When his illness, I had Trotsky and Lenin. Trotsky died young, in an untimely fashion, of course. Be careful what you name your companion. When his illness became apparent at the age of 14, I took him to the vet, who told me he had kidney disease. 2 thoughts occurred to me then, that I had let him get this sick, and that it was a disease, and so perhaps could be treated. Both ways of thinking internalize the responsibility for death in the form of disease, and neither allows for the acknowledgement of mortality as a condition of living. This too has taught me something about the mortality I share with the non-human living. Deleuze and Guattari were right. We middle-class Westerners have Oedipalized our companion animals, and now they too are humanized, their mortality biomedicalized and capitalized, just like ours. Indeed, as Karis Thompson has argued, many animals have also been genetically humanized to provide richer and better sources of and resources for biomedical research in experiments designed to help us, the humans, overcome our condition of mortality, which, in this logic, is, after all, only another disease. 3, Laburo, I suffer. Because the question of animal rights emerges in the context of a 19th century abolitionist discourse, Bentham was also perhaps drawing on the sense of suffering conveyed by the Latin word laburo, to suffer or labor. For labor was indeed also one of the terms of rightless human and non-human animal suffering, whether it was the labor of the slave, the human factory worker, or the ubiquitously abused cart horse. And invoking Thompson's work on experimental animal humanization reminds me of the laboring already dead, those who are exploited and killed in staggering numbers to supply ever more surplus profit in the consumption of their bodies. This is what I think Donna Haraway means when she says, extraordinarily modestly, and I caution folks not to forget the modesty of her argument here, that, and I'm quoting her, "It is a misstep to separate the world's beings into those who may be killed and those who may not, and a misstep to pretend to live outside killing." Judith Butler, meditating on the way war makes of our enemies just such killable beings, cautions us that, and I'm quoting her, "Our capacity to feel and to apprehend hangs in the balance when we establish whose lives can be marked as lives and whose deaths will count as deaths. So too, she reminds us, does the fate of the reality of certain lives and deaths. For Emmanuel Levinas, whose ethics of responsibility toward the other Butler takes up in Precarious Life, what counts in the encounter with the other is something called face. And he doesn't mean your actual face. The face of the other is the ethical injunction not to kill. It is the confrontation with another's vulnerability, mortality, and precariousness. And parenthetically, this confrontation is a struggle, however, for the response to vulnerability is also, at least in Levinas's apprehension of things, often a murderous impulse. To respond to the face, to understand its meaning, this is Butler, means to be awake to what is precarious in another life, or rather, the precariousness of life itself. Butler concludes, one would need to hear the face as it speaks in something other than language to know the precariousness of life that is at stake. 4, encounter. In this spirit of coming to terms with a face that speaks in other than language, and an attempt to come to terms with the consequences of rendering killable, both for one's so-called humanity and for the lives and deaths of the other, I want to end with a story of an encounter that might also be a parable. I had a rat problem. I live in the country, and well, rats do too. My house is an old house and not airtight. It is also built into the hillside. Parts of it are underground, separated from the earth by what are called rubble walls, river rock with very little cement between. One winter, when it was very cold and wet, the rats, especially, I think, the moms, decided to move in. Now, the rats there, are gorgeous, with clean, glossy brown coats, nothing like the caricature of dirty urban vermin normally conjured when there's talk of an infestation. They are also huge, much too imposing for most of the neighborhood cats. The problem I'd been experiencing had to do with sound. They shrieked and hollered in my walls at night. Rats are very loquacious. And with smell. Rats, especially nesting mothers, produce a strong, unmistakable, and to the human olfactory senses, very unpleasant odor. After a week of setting traps that worked for the first 2 days, after which the rats, being intelligent, changed their routes, foregoing the delicious peanut butter and cheese lures I had prepared, I used, once and only once, and never again, I promise, poison. One day, I came home, and as I approached my kitchen, I saw, perched on the counter, a very large rat. She sat there, aware of my presence, and looked at me. I stood there, aware of hers, and pondered my dilemma. I had no idea what to do. As I walked cautiously toward her, she moved away, returning to the crevice from which she had apparently emerged. And as she departed, I noticed a smear of blood trailing behind her and knew that she was dying. Rat poison causes internal bleeding. That's how the rat who ingests it dies. Now, I know that humans hate rats with a passion, and I know that I, though not hating them, did not want one in or near my shelter. But I did not, till that moment, know how viciously sadistic human methods of eliminating them, including my own, could be. As it turned out, the rat exacted her revenge, albeit unwittingly. She died behind my kitchen counter, somewhere near the rebel wall, and for weeks I could smell the rotting corpse, reminding me of what I had so willfully and yet so thoughtlessly done. But there was that moment when we exchanged gazes, she with the eyes of a dying mortal, and I with the eyes of a murderer, newly conscious of the enormity of the crime I had committed against her.